Okay, last video here, there's just a couple more things that I want to talk about really quickly here in relation to species distributions and the dynamics of a geographic range of a species. And specifically, I want to talk about how abundance can play a role in the changing distribution or the dynamics of a species distribution. So the abundance and spatial distribution of some species can vary quite a bit over time, and the African locust is a good example of this, where there's even biblical tales about these things, historically notorious for these types of wild fluctuations, where um, just from a few source areas, depending on what happens with regional climate and other factors, that this species can undergo a huge explosion in population and expand its geographic range across almost the entire southern continent of Africa, and so that's some wild variation. And so you might say, it's only located in a few locations here. Like, what's the entire geographic range of this species? Kind of depends on the timing of when you're looking at it, and other factors as well. You might also apply the same concept to things that migrate seasonally, like birds. Some species of birds have, winter areas where they're living over the winter, and maybe they have breeding locations and breeding seasons. So temporally, their ranges are going to change, and that's going to be, a factor of the climate, but also, their internal reproductive cycles as well. So again, these spatial distributions can change over time, and that adds some nuance into when you're looking at, what is a species geographic range. And if you're looking at abundance specifically across the geographic range, it tends to vary systematically. So here we're looking at a bird species. I forget again what species this is, but you can kind of see, and this is pretty characteristic, you can see these high levels of abundance towards the center and then sort of decreasing. And that's something we introduced, if you think back to that first video when we were talking about how individuals are spread out. Across the geographic range, that's essentially what we're talking about here, is the abundance. But you tend to get more variation as well. So here, the coefficient of variation is not, I'm not going to get into the statistics of what that means, but basically you can see that you have low variation towards the center and high variation. So the abundance, is doesn't change much in this area, but as you move out, you get a big increase in the amount of variation. So some of these areas might have really high abundance and some might have really low, whereas in the center of the range it tends to be pretty stably high variation, or sorry, high abundance. So, so what ultimately limits the geographic range? I mean, we talked about the idea of the niche and the fundamental niche, but why do those things matter in the first place? It kind of comes down to some ideas about, what limits population growth, and you have this law of the minimum. You may have come across this at some point. It's pretty commonly employed in like agriculture and ecology as well, but it's a little simplistic. But the basic idea is that, there's some limiting factor for any given species in any given area. There's a limiting factor. It might be different for different species, but there's going to be something that's not some maybe some resource, I guess would be the best way to put this, that isn't as abundant as other resources, and it's something that that species needs, and so that species population numbers are ultimately dependent and limited by that factor. And it's I think theoretically it's a good thing to think about conceptually, but it's a little bit too simplistic to be able to use and or to fully explain what's going on in real situations. We can look at some things that are similar. So the saguaro cactus is kind of an interesting one that sort of demonstrates this a little bit. So the distribution is limited by minimum temperatures, and so you might say that temperature is a limiting factor for this species. And when you're looking at this, you can see the distribution. We have a dot map. and then this outline is actually this desert here, and then you have this other purple shaded region, which is where you have 12 to 24 continuous hours below freezing. Below 0 degrees is mapped in here, so it's just this area that gets a little bit colder than the other areas. That's the minimum temperature that gets there. Um, the saguaro cactus is almost not found at all in that region, and it tends to only be found in regions where the minimum temperature does not get below that. And in fact, I think there's two things. So it doesn't have a continuous freeze, so there's no, in this area, it just does not, for longer than 12 hours, it doesn't get below that. Also doesn't get below, I think it's -7. I think -7 degrees Celsius is sort of the threshold where if it gets below that at all, you're going to see some significant mortality in this species. What happens is it damages the tips of the shoots off the stem here, if I understand that right, and can kill them over time. And certain, I think younger plants tend to be more vulnerable than older plants. But the point here is that, you might say temperature is a limiting factor here, but you really need to understand the mechanism. It's not necessarily maximum temperature. It's not even really a seasonal thing, even though it might occur in some seasons more than others. It's more about the minimum temperature specifically and the time at which the minimum temperature spends below a certain threshold. So the mechanism really matters when you're talking about this law of the minimum. Similar to this is, if you've ever heard the timber line or the tree line, where it's basically the upper elevational limit of trees, which is influenced by a combination of things. So, when you go up a mountain, you might have a forest for a while, but if it's a tall enough mountain, eventually you're going to get high enough that the trees can't grow anymore, and that line is called the timber line, and it's different for different mountain ranges. Kind of depends on where you're at, because it's a combination of a lot of things. It's not just the elevation, but it's going to be the latitude, which you can see here. But it's also going to be, the reason there's these different lines for different mountain ranges, and they're not all following along the same line, is that there's different mean temperatures. There's different aspects, which is, the direction that the mountain is facing can have an influence on the temperature. The amount of wind, the snow depth, the water balance, all these things, all these combinations of things are going to influence this. And these are actually, this is a bristlecone pine. These species tend to grow on some of the highest slopes and highest timber lines, and you get these really gnarly looking trees. And these are actually really important for tree ring studies because they grow really, really slow, but they live a really long time. And you can take cores from them and measure the tree rings, and you can get, they're really sensitive, and so you can get some really good information about what past climates were like, and reconstruct, temperature and things like that. So just a little side note there. But yeah, timber lines in general sort of reflect this complexity of the law of the minimum, where there's lots of limiting factors when you take into account elevational changes. Biotic interactions can also influence a species' geographic range. I think you probably read a little bit about this, but something called competitive exclusion is pretty common, where here we have this small mammal, these several species of small mammals that are very similar and probably all have the same, or highly similar fundamental geographic range and fundamental ecological niche. Their realized niche and realized range is much smaller because of competitive exclusion. They're competing. Some of them can compete in different areas better, and so they're sort of pushing each other out here, and so they have different geographic ranges, and we call this, competitive exclusion. And there's different types of these sorts of interactions. Like some tree species, like walnuts, produce it's called, I think, allelopathy. Anyway, they produce these toxins, and certain trees can't grow near them, or certain lots of plant species can't grow near them. So there's different examples of these kinds of things. Okay, so I'm going to wrap things up. I want to if we were to sort of distill this chapter into three main points, I think it would be that A geographic range is rarely limited by a single factor. There's lots of things that influence where a species is located, and these limiting factors are scale dependent. So if you think back, we were talking about scale. It depends on what scale you're looking at is going to influence, which factors are being the limiting factor at that scale. And abundance tends to be high near the center of the range where conditions are favorable, and then you could extend this and say abundance tends to be low, when you get towards the edge of the range and conditions are less favorable, and abundance tends to be more variable there as well. So some main points to take away there. Otherwise, keep working your way through, get to the end of the module here. There's one more reading and a discussion, and then, get to the assignment, and otherwise, continue on. We're going to continue this format for the foreseeable future. I don't see any changes. Seems to be working well for everybody. So we're just going to keep doing online modules. And so keep working your way through this one, and I will see you next week in the next week's module.